Alright, so I'm a little sick right now, so just bear with me. So today I'll be refuting a claim that renewable energy production, like solar and wind, will create more jobs compared to fossil fuel production as the world innovates and implements clean energy. It's my stance that based on the numerous flaws and evidence that the advocate presents, as well as my own personal research, I do not believe that this conclusion can be made. So beginning with the opponent's first secondary claim, which is that the production of renewable energy is more labor intensive compared to fossil fuel production, resulting in more employment. The advocate supports this with two major sources of evidence. The first being an article written in Forbes magazine by Mike Scott, which notes that the renewable sector has passed 10 million employed for the first time, which he then uses in contrast to the U.S. Department of Energy report in 2017 that projects a 12% decrease in traditional sources within 2018. Now this comparison is problematic for a number of reasons. The first being that the Forbes magazine is on the scale of the entire world, the 10 million that is, whereas the U.S. Department of Energy is obviously only on the U.S. So I believe that because you can't necessarily compare a single country like the U.S. to the entire world, where the world contains the majority of a significantly larger number of the employed people, as well as the fact that these two evidence points do not actually address how renewable energy is more labor intensive to traditional sources. I believe that the advocate creates a false connection that does not in fact support this secondary claim, so he cannot make that in regards to his main claim. Moving on to the second, the advocate uses an evidence point noting that a company called Siemens had to release 6,900 employees in the year 2017. I'd argue, however, that one company and its performance does not represent the entire industry of the non-renewable sector, because a drop in 6,900 employees is nowhere proportional to the 12% decrease that is projected earlier by the U.S. Department of Energy, because with over 1.1 million people employed in the U.S. alone, this represents less than a 0.75% drop in the total employment in the U.S. In addition, he supports this second claim that the workforce is already competing with the fossil fuel sector with another statistic from this 2017 U.S. Department of Energy report that projected a 25% growth in solar and 32% growth in the wind industry. However, when I looked up the most recent information from 2018, the 2018 report, in fact, solar actually dropped by 3.8% in the previous year. So because of these 2 points, I'd like to argue that though the renewable and non-renewable sectors are in fact competing with each other for jobs, this competition is nowhere as near as one-sided as the advocate presents. Rather, this may be attributed to simply just governmental changes in governmental policy, as well as natural economic trends, as supported by further research inside of the U.S. Department of Energy 2017 report, which shows similar trends in the past years, being 2015 and 2016. And finally, and probably most problematically, is the opponent's third claim, which is that energy production is being pushed forward by bills and laws that require the transition to renewable sources. The advocate uses the main example of SB 100, which is a bill signed into law last year in 2018 in California, which declares California's intent to be 100% renewable in terms of energy production by the year 2045. As well as similar laws passed by other states. This whole portion of this argument hinges on the assumption that the transition to renewable energy is inevitable, and this is mostly, I believe, however, you cannot make this argument as there's insufficient evidence, mostly because of the fact that SB 100 is simply a declaration of intent of California, but does not actually lay out a clear path to do so. The majority of SB 100 is dedicated to outlining the transition of the timeline, as well as the consequences for any non-compliers with this bill. In fact, it notes that any penalties noted by or collected by the State Air Resources Board shall be expended for reducing emissions of air pollution or greenhouse gases within the geographic area collected. So because of the fact that the bill outlines the transition and kind of forces it onto the non-renewable sector, it would logically explain why this sector is actually decreasing employment as companies move to comply with the new law and keep up with the changing times. So as a result, I think that the changing in the industry is actually a result of governmental policy instead of the superiority or competition of the renewable energy sector, rather than, because of the fact that the government is forcing this on them. That is explaining the reason why the non-renewable sector is in fact dropping in employment. So though the advocate presents a case for this inference to be true, that the renewable sector is in fact growing more as time goes on than the non-renewable sector, I believe that lackluster and contradictory evidence do not support this, and therefore the claim the advocate makes cannot be made with the evidence provided.
All right, your analysis on the first point tries to point out an inconsistency with the base numbers that we're looking at, and I thought that that was a pretty reasonable challenge on that particular point. You do suggest that there's a valid question here as to why the non-renewables are more labor intensive, and you didn't think that that was explained very clearly. That's a reasonable press to put into place. On the second point, you diminished the importance of the singular example pretty effectively by showing how insignificant it is in the total amount of employment in the energy sector. And then the same sort of thing, I thought, this was maybe the strongest part of the argument, where you showed that the projections of growth in solar were in fact not met, and in fact they were declining and going in the opposite direction, which seems to suggest that there is a problem with the premise of the advocate's general argument. Your third point comes down to the notion that the source of this change is got little to do with the efficacy of the energy systems or the competition that goes on there. It's all got to do with government intervention into the marketplace and the distortion that that creates. There's not really a discussion of what the consequences of that will be in the long run. And I do think that you have a legitimate point in pointing out that SB 100 is a set of guidelines. It is not really a policy that puts these things into place, but it's a declaration of what they want to have. Although it does sound like there are some penalties that are involved, because you spend some time talking about that. But I do think at the end you kind of remind us, the whole point of this is an argument that says, well, no wonder they're succeeding, or the one industry is going to be favored over the other industry. It's basically we've put ball and chain on the one industry so that they can't move forward, and we've given an incentive to the other industry to go forward. And so this seems like the natural result of government policy, as opposed to whether or not the energy systems are competitive. And I thought that was a reasonable point to make. All right, thank you. We're going to stop here.